Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. In the vast and tamed heart of the American West, gold ain't the most valuable thing a man can have. It's the loyalty of the man watching his back. But what happens when that loyalty turns to lead? When the brother who shared your last bullet decides it's meant for your spine? Today, we're telling a story of trust shattered by greed and a reckoning that clawed its way back from the grave. If you believe a man's true grit is shown when he's got nothing left to lose, then you're in the right place. Go on and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a single tale of dust, blood, and redemption. Now, settle in by the fire as we tell the tale of a man they left for dead in the sun. A man who came back with hell in his eyes. The fire crackled, a lone beacon of life in the sprawling, ink-black canvas of the New Mexico territory. It spat embers into the night, fleeting constellations that died before they could find their place among the cold, distant stars. Around its warmth sat the only family Jedediah Jedstone had ever known, the Black Creek Gang. To an outsider, they were a collection of ghosts and nightmares. Silas Kane, their leader, was a man whose past was a locked box he never opened. He had the sharp, hawkish features of a predator and quoted scripture with a chilling sincerity. Earning him the moniker the Preacher, he could soothe the nervous homesteader with a honeyed verse 1 minute and plan the meticulous ruin of a payroll train the next. His voice, a low baritone that commanded respect, was the thread that stitched their ragged band together. Then there was Dutch Vander Linde, a mountain of a man with fists like hammers and a laugh that could shake the rocks. He was the muscle, the immovable object, loyal to Silas to a fault. Little Leo, weary and quick, with eyes that missed nothing, was their scout. He could read a trail like a city man reads a newspaper and move through the brush with the silence of a shadow. And finally, there was Marco, the Mexican, whose skill with a throwing knife was as legendary as his temper. He was quiet, watchful, and deadly. And there was Jed. He wasn't the biggest, nor the fastest, nor the most cunning, but he was the heart. He was the one who remembered the little things, the way Silas liked his coffee, the brand of whiskey Dutch favored after a score, the fact that little Leo couldn't abide the taste of beans. He was the gang's conscience, a role he hadn't asked for but had earned through a quiet and wavering sense of fidelity. They had been together for 6 years, a lifetime in their profession. 6 years of sharing hardtack and stolen beef, of sleeping under the same blanket of stars, of patching each other's wounds in dusty rows with whiskey for antiseptic and a prayer for anesthetic. They had bled together on the floors of raided banks and laughed together in the cat houses of forgotten border towns. Jed had taken a bullet meant for Silas in a botched job outside of Santa Fe, a jagged scar above his hip that ached when the cold set in. Silas, in turn, had carried Jed for 2 days across the desert to a sawbones doctor, refusing to leave him behind. That was the foundation of Jed's world, a bedrock of shared blood and shared gold. He trusted these men with his life, not because he was naive, but because they had proven their worth time and again. He'd seen Silas split their last canteen for ways under a sun that boiled the very air. He'd watched Dutch stand over a wounded Leo, roaring defiance at a posse that outnumbered them 3-1, refusing to give an inch until Leo was safely on his horse. This wasn't just a gang, it was a brotherhood, forged in gunpowder and tempered in the desperate flight from the law. Jedediah, Silas's voice cut through the quiet hum of the night, pulling him from his thoughts. Your mind is 1,000 miles away, pondering the angels. Jed offered a small smile, poking the fire with a stick. Just the opposite, preacher. Thinking about how we got here. Dutch let out a hearty chuckle, taking a long pull from a bottle of rye. By being smarter and meaner than every other son of a bitch with a gun, that's how. There's truth in that, Silas conceded, his eyes glinting in the firelight. He had a way of looking at a man that made him feel seen, understood. But Jed's right to be reflective. We've ridden a long, hard road. We've buried good men, and we've outrun the devil himself more times than I can count. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over them. Which is why the next job. It's the most important one of our lives. This was it. The job Silas had been planning for months. The one he spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. The promised land, he called it. An army payroll wagon, carrying a fortune in freshly minted gold coin, payment for every soldier west of the Mississippi. It was audacious, bordering on suicidal. The wagon would be guarded by a full company of cavalry. Army payroll's a different beast, Silas, little Leo said, his voice a nervous whisper. That ain't some backwater bank with a half-asleep sheriff. That's the U.S. government. The U.S. government is just a collection of men, Leo, Silas countered smoothly. And men, no matter the color of their uniform, can be surprised. They can be outsmarted. They bleed, and they die. He unrolled a crude, hand-drawn map on a flat rock near the fire. He used the tip of his bowie knife to trace a route through a narrow, winding canyon. Here, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. Canyon Diablo. The cavalry will be expecting an ambush at the mouth, or maybe at the wide basin halfway through. They'll be on high alert, but they won't be looking for trouble here. He tapped a section where the canyon walls squeezed together, barely wide enough for the wagon to pass. The acoustics are a devil's whisper in this stretch. We set a charge high on the north wall, just enough to block the pass behind them once they're through. Another charge at the front. We trap them. A perfect kill box. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. Jed studied the map, his mind racing through the logistics. The timing would have to be perfect. The placement of the dynamite, flawless. Any mistake would bring the wrath of the U.S. Army down on their heads. But the payoff. It was enough to make a man forget the risks. Enough for all of them to disappear, to buy a new life, a clean slate. We do this, Silas continued, his eyes scanning each of their faces, and we're done. No more looking over our shoulders. No more sleeping with one eye open. We take our shares, we ride in opposite directions, and we become ghosts. We become cattle ranchers, businessmen, whatever we damn well please. We become honest men. The irony of the statement hung in the air, thick as the smoke from the fire. Becoming honest men through one last, monumental act of thievery. Yet, in Silas's sermon, it sounded like salvation. Jed looked around the circle. Dutch was grinning, the promise of wealth and a lifetime of whiskey gleaming in his eyes. Leo was still nervous, but the meticulous detail of Silas's plan was clearly winning him over. Marco's face was unreadable, as always, but his hand rested on the hilt of his knife, a sign of his readiness. Jed felt a surge of pride, of belonging. This was his family, poised on the brink of their greatest triumph. He would follow Silas into the mouth of hell itself, because he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Silas would do the same for him. He believed in the bond they shared, a bond thicker than blood, sealed in the crucible of a shared, outlaw existence. In his world of shifting allegiances and fleeting loyalties, the constancy of the Black Creek Gang was the only creed he held sacred. It was the only thing left to believe in. "When do we ride?" Jed asked, his voice steady, his resolve absolute. Silas smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. "At dawn," he said. "We ride at dawn to claim our kingdom." The fire burned low, and one by one, the men rolled into their blankets, the promise of a golden future filling their dreams. Jed lay awake for a long while, staring up at the vast and caring sky. A flicker of unease, formless and fleeting, pricked at the edge of his consciousness. He dismissed it as pre-job jitters. It was the biggest score of their lives. It was only natural to feel the weight of it. He closed his eyes, the faces of his brothers clear in his mind. Dutch, Leo, Marco, and Silas. His family. He would die for them. He was sure of it. What he could never have imagined, in that final, peaceful moment of ignorance, was that they would not do the same for him. His faith, as pure and solid as the gold they sought, was about to be ground into the unforgiving desert sand. And the only thing to rise from its ruins would be a ghost fueled by a singular, burning purpose, revenge. He just didn't know it yet. As he drifted to sleep, his last conscious thought was of the morning, of the ride, of the victory they would share. Together. Always together. Dawn broke across the plains, painting the horizon in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. The air was cool and thin, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the nervous energy of 5 men about to gamble their lives against the United States Army. The Black Creek Gang rode in silence, a stark contrast to their usual boisterous camaraderie. The easy jokes and shared swigs of whiskey were gone, replaced by a tense, focused quiet. Jed rode beside Silas, his gaze fixed on the rising sun, his heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm against his ribs. He felt the weight of the moment, the precipice they stood upon. This wasn't just another job, it was their exodus, their final, violent sermon before they washed their hands of the life and were reborn as kings. Canyon Diablo was a jagged scar carved into the earth, a place the Apache believed was a gateway to the underworld. Its red rock walls rose hundreds of feet, baked by a merciless sun, and the path through it was treacherous and narrow. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Following Silas's plan, they worked with the quiet efficiency of a wolf pack. Dutch, with his brute strength, moved boulders to create cover. Little Leo, light on his feet, scaled a sheer rock face to act as a lookout, a human hawk against the sky. Marco and Jed handled the dynamite, their hands steady as they set the charges, burying the sticks of devil's toothpicks in pre-scouted crevices in the canyon walls. The waiting was the hardest part. The sun climbed, turning the canyon floor into a furnace. The silence was absolute, broken only by the buzz of flies and the sound of their own breathing. Jed lay behind a rock outcropping, his rifle resting on the warm stone. He could feel the grit of sand on his teeth, the sweat trickling down his spine. He looked over at Silas, who sat calmly, reading from his worn leather Bible as if he were waiting for a Sunday service to begin. That calm was infectious. It settled Jed's nerves. Silas had a plan. Silas always had a plan. Hours later, Leo gave a soft whistle, the signal they'd been waiting for. Jed peered through his rifle's sight. In the distance, a column of dust rose against the blue sky. First came the outriders, then the heavy, lumbering Pirol wagon, its canvas cover hiding a fortune, and behind it, a troop of blue-coated cavalrymen, their sabers and carbines glinting in the sun. They rode with a confident arrogance, unaware they were riding into their own grave. Let them pass the first marker. Silas's voice was a low command that cut through the tension. Wait for my signal. The wagon rumbled into the narrowest part of the canyon. The sound of its iron-rimmed wheels echoed off the rock walls. Jed held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger of the detonator plunger. The lead riders were almost through the kill box. Now, Silas commanded. Jed slammed his hand down. The world erupted in a deafening roar of fire and rock. The explosion at the far end of the pass sent a landslide of boulders crashing down, sealing the exit. Before the troopers could react, Marco triggered the second charge, blocking the entrance behind them. They were trapped. Panic erupted among the cavalry. Horses screamed and reared, and soldiers shouted in confusion. From the canyon walls, the Black Creek gang opened fire. It was a slaughter. The soldiers, caught in the open with no cover, were easy targets. Jed worked his rifle with mechanical precision, firing, ejecting the shell, chambering a new round, and firing again. He didn't see them as men. They were obstacles, blue uniformed barriers between his family and their future. Dutch roared with savage joy, his heavy buffalo gun punching through men and horses alike. Leo's carbine barked from his high perch, picking off officers with deadly accuracy. Marco's knives, silent and swift, found their mark on the few soldiers who tried to scramble up the rocks for cover. And through it all, Silas stood exposed, firing his twin Colts with a terrifying, righteous fury, his voice booming over the din of battle. "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away," he bellowed, each punctuation a blast of gunfire. The fight was brutal and short. In minutes, the canyon floor was littered with the dead and dying. A handful of surviving soldiers surrendered, throwing down their weapons in despair. The gang descended from their perches, their faces grim and smeared with gunpowder. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the acrid smoke of spent cartridges. They worked quickly, rounding up the remaining horses and moving the gold. The heavy wooden chests were broken open, revealing the gleaming treasure within. Sacks were filled with freshly minted double eagles, so heavy they required 2 men to lift them onto the pack mules. The sheer weight of their victory was staggering. As they loaded the last bag, the laughter started. It began with Dutch, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed in the quiet canyon. Soon, they were all laughing, the bloody tension of the battle releasing in a wave of triumphant relief. They had done it. They had challenged the United States Army and won. They had secured their future. As Jed hoisted a heavy sack of gold onto his saddle, he caught Silas's eye. The preacher smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I told you, Jedediah," he said, clapping Jed on the shoulder. "The righteous shall inherit the earth." In that moment, standing amidst the carnage and the riches, Jed felt an overwhelming sense of loyalty. They had faced death together and emerged victorious. They were more than a gang. They were a force of nature, an unbreakable brotherhood. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the canyon. It was time to ride, to disappear into the desert and begin their new lives. The laughter died down, but the sense of accomplishment remained, a warm glow in Jed's chest. The hard part was over. Now, all that was left was to divide the spoils and ride their separate ways, forever bound by the blood they had spilled and the gold they had won. They rode for half a day, pushing deeper into the merciless expanse of the desert, leaving Canyon Diablo and its ghosts far behind. They found a secluded spot, a small box canyon shielded by weathered rock formations that would hide them from any wandering eyes. The sun was a hammer in a brass sky, and the heat was suffocating. This was it, the final gathering. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of the gold almost a physical presence among them. "Let's get to it," Dutch boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. He eagerly pulled the heavy sacks from the packed mules, the gold clinking with a sound sweeter than any music. "Time to count our blessings." They gathered in a circle, the bags of gold in the center. The mood was light, triumphant. Silas pulled out his Bible, as was his tradition after a successful score. "Before we divide the spoils of our labor," he began, his voice taking on its familiar preacher's cadence, "let us give thanks." But as he spoke, Jed noticed something off. The usual warmth in Silas's eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating glint. Little Leo fidgeted nervously, unable to meet Jed's gaze. Marco stood unnervingly still, his hand resting near the hilt of his knife. Only Dutch seemed his usual self, his face flushed with greed and excitement. A flicker of unease, the same one he'd felt the night before, returned to Jed. He pushed it down. This was just the tension of the final moments, the strain of saying goodbye. "Jedediah," Silas said, closing his Bible, "you have been the heart of this family. It is only fitting you do the honors. Open the first bag." Jed smiled, the feeling of pride washing away his doubt. He knelt down, his back to the others, and reached for the leather ties on the nearest sack. He saw his future in that bag, a small ranch, a quiet life, a world away from the constant running. He was so focused on the task, on the feel of the rough burlap under his fingers, that he didn't hear the whisper-soft sound behind him, click of a pistol's hammer being drawn back. A deafening roar shattered the desert silence. A white-hot sledgehammer slammed into his back, just below his right shoulder blade. The force threw him forward, his face hitting the hard, dusty ground. The air rushed from his lungs in a pained gasp. For a moment, there was only confusion, a ringing in his ears. He thought it must be a stray cavalryman who had tracked them, a final, dying act of defiance. Then, slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up, twisting to face his brothers, to warn them. But they weren't looking for an enemy. They were looking at him. Silas stood with his Colt still smoking in his hand, his face a mask of cold resolve. Dutch's greedy smile had vanished, replaced by a look of grim necessity. Leo wouldn't look at him, staring at his own boots in shame. Marco's expression was, as always, unreadable, but there was no pity in his dark eyes. The world tilted on its axis. The heat, the sun, the weight of the gold had all faded away, replaced by a single, soul-crushing realization. The shot hadn't come from an enemy. It had come from his family. "Silas." "Why?" Jed choked out, the words tasting of blood and betrayal. Silas holstered his pistol, his movements calm and deliberate. He looked down at Jed not with hatred, but with a chilling, detached pity, like a man putting a lame horse out of its misery. "The good shepherd must sometimes cull the flock for the good of the rest," Silas said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Your share, Jedediah, was your sentimentality. It was a weakness we could no longer afford. 5 shares are better than 6. It's simple arithmetic. We were brothers," Jed whispered, the pain in his heart far eclipsing the fire in his back. Dutch grunted, kicking a cloud of dust near Jed's face. "Business, Jed. Nothing personal." The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it felt like the world was ending. The 6 years of shared hardship, the blood they'd spilled for each other, the unwavering trust he had placed in these men, it had all been a lie. He had been a tool, a convenience, and now his usefulness had expired. They didn't even grant him the dignity of a final look. They turned their backs on him, dividing the gold that was stained with his blood. They loaded their horses, their movements efficient and practiced. The last thing Jed saw as his vision began to blur and darken at the edges was Silas, mounting his horse, Jed's share of the gold in his saddlebags. Silas paused and looked down at him one last time. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, he intoned a final, blasphemous benediction. May God have mercy on your soul, brother, for we shall have none. Then they were gone. The sound of their hoofbeats faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert, leaving Jed alone, bleeding into the sand under the cruel, watchful eye of the sun. The world went black, but in that darkness, a single, cold ember of hatred began to glow. They had taken his life, his loyalty, his past, but they had failed to take his last breath. And in that breath, a new purpose was born. Pain was the first thing to return. It was a living entity, a fire that consumed his back and spread molten tendrils through every nerve in his body. Jed awoke to a world of suffering. The sun had moved across the sky, and he was now in the full, brutal glare of the afternoon. His blood had soaked into the sand beneath him, turning it a dark, ugly crimson. Thirst was a physical torment, his throat a desert of its own, his tongue a swollen, useless piece of leather. He tried to move, but the effort sent a fresh wave of agony through him. He was a broken thing, left to be baked into the earth. Above him, he saw them dark specks circling high in the bleached blue sky. Vultures. They were patient, waiting for the last twitch of life to cease before they descended for their feast. The sight should have filled him with terror, with despair. Instead, it filled him with a cold, clarifying rage. Not like this. The thought was a flicker at first, then a roaring flame. He would not die for the convenience of Silas Kane. He would not become carrion for desert scavengers. His life, which he had so freely offered in loyalty to his brothers, was now his own again, and he would claw it back from the brink for one reason and one reason only, to watch them die. The faces of his betrayers burned in his mind's eye. Leo's shifty avoidance, Dutch's brutish indifference, Marco's silent complicity, and Silas's sanctimonious, self-serving justification. The memory of their shared past, once a source of strength and pride, now curdled into pure poison. Every laugh, every shared meal, every moment of camaraderie was a lie he had foolishly believed. This burning hatred became his fuel. It gave him the strength to move. He began to crawl. It was a pathetic, agonizing motion. He dragged his body through the sand and rock, every inch of victory paid for in blood and torment. He had no direction, no destination other than away from the spot of his own murder, away from the patient circling of the vultures. Days and nights blurred into a seamless hell. He licked moisture from cool rocks in the pre-dawn hours. He chewed the bitter flesh of a cactus, its spines tearing at his mouth, for the single drop of liquid it offered. He was no longer a man, he was a primal force of survival, driven by a singular, obsessive purpose. He hallucinated, seeing the ghosts of the men he'd killed, and the living ghosts of the men he would kill. They taunted him, their faces swirling in the heat haze. But even in his delirium, his purpose held firm. He was on the verge of his last breath, his body finally ready to surrender, when a shape appeared on the horizon. It was a man, old and grizzled, eating a stubborn-looking mule. A prospector, one of the desert's forgotten souls. The old man, whose name was Elias, found Jed half buried in the sand, more dead than alive. Elias, having seen his share of the West's cruelty, didn't ask questions. He saw the bullet hole in Jed's back, saw the feverish, determined glare in his eyes, and simply grunted. He loaded Jed onto his mule and took him to his ramshackle hut, a hovel built into the side of a sun-blasted mesa. For weeks, Elias tended to Jed's wounds with rough, but effective, frontier medicine. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, dug out fragments of cloth and lead with the tip of a hot knife, and packed it with a poultice of herbs. The fever nearly took Jed several times, plunging him into nightmares where he relived the betrayal over and over. During his recovery, Jed barely spoke. He was a changed man. The easygoing, loyal outlaw was dead and buried back in that canyon. In his place was a specter, a hollowed-out man filled with nothing but the cold, hard granite of vengeance. His eyes, once quick to smile, were now chips of ice. He spent his waking hours regaining his strength, pushing his body past the limits of pain. And he practiced. The bullet had damaged nerves in his right shoulder, making his famous quick draw with his right hand a thing of the past. So, with grim determination, he learned to shoot with his left. He spent hours a day, every day, drawing and firing an old pistol Elias owned, until the motion was as natural as breathing. He was remaking himself into the instrument of his own revenge. One evening, as the sun set, Jed stood before Elias, his wounds scarred over but his purpose clear. He was no longer a patient. He was a hunter. "I mean you're dead, old man," Jed said, his voice a gravelly rasp, rough from disuse. Elias just spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Ain't no dead. The desert tries to kill us all. You just fought back harder than most. What are you hunting that's got you looking like the devil himself?" Jed looked out at the horizon, towards the world that had forgotten him. "5 ghosts," he said, his voice low and cold. "And I'm the Reaper." Jedediah left Elias's hovel a different man. The desert had not killed him. It had boiled him down to his essence, leaving behind a skeleton wrapped in leather and hate. He was no longer Jed, the loyal brother of the Black Creek Gang. That man had died from Silas's bullet. The figure who walked away from the old prospector's claim was a ghost, a nameless thing with a singular purpose. He drifted east, toward the territories where men gathered, where gold flowed and stories were told. He knew that men like Leo and Dutch, arrogant and undisciplined, could not keep quiet about their newfound wealth. Their pride would be their news. He just had to be patient enough to hear them kicking. For months, he was a phantom on the landscape. He worked on ranches for grub and a bed in the hayloft, his muscles slowly regaining their coiled strength under the sun. He hauled freight in railhead towns, his ears open to the talk of travelers and merchants. He became part of the scenery, a gaunt, bearded face with eyes that never quite looked at you, but seemed to look through you. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a dry rasp, like stones grinding together. The easy camaraderie he once possessed was gone, replaced by a wall of silent, watchful intensity that kept most folks at a comfortable distance. He learned to live with the pain. The wound in his back was a constant, dull ache, a physical reminder of the betrayal. It flared up in the cold and burned when he strained himself, but he welcomed it. It was a whetstone for his rage, keeping the edge of his purpose sharp. Every twinge was a whisper of Silas's voice, every stab of pain a memory of Dutch's indifferent grunt. The trail was colder than a banker's heart. The Black Creek Gang had scattered to the four winds, just as Silas had planned. They were ghosts too, but ghosts enjoying their stolen heaven while he clawed his way through a living hell. Doubt was a venomous serpent that sometimes coiled in his gut during the long, lonely nights. What if they had been smart? What if they had truly disappeared, living quiet lives under new names? The thought was intolerable. It would mean they had won, that his suffering, his survival, meant nothing. He would force the thought down, smothering it with the memory of the gunshot, the laughter, and their backs as they rode away. His break came in a clapboard saloon in the Texas Panhandle, a place thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and desperation. He was sitting in a dark corner, nursing a cup of black coffee, when two trail-worn cowboys stumbled in, loud with cheap whiskey and fresh pay. They bellied up to the bar, their talk turning to a town 100 miles west called Redemption. "You ever see a man throw gold eagles around like they was pebbles?" one of them asked, his voice slurring. "This little fella, calls himself Lucky Leo, runs a poker game out of the hotel, cleans everyone out, but don't matter, 'cause he loses it just as fast at the faro table." Jed's head came up slowly, his senses, honed by months of listening, locked onto the conversation. "Yeah, I heard of him," the other cowboy replied. "Nervous little fella, ain't he? Jumps at his own shadow. But he's got a poke that never runs dry. Brags about a big score he was part of, down in the territories. Says he earned his retirement." The description hit Jed like a physical blow. Weary, nervous, bragging, flashy with gold. It was little Leo. It had to be. The carelessness, the loud-mouthed boasting, it was Leo to the bone. He had always been the weakest link, the one most desperate for approval and recognition. Jed stood up, his movements stiff. He dropped a nickel on the table for the coffee and walked out of the saloon without a word, leaving the two cowboys to their drunken chatter. Outside, the night air was cool. He looked up at the moon, a sliver of bone in the black sky. The hunt was no longer a vague, burning need. It had a name and a place. Redemption. A bitter irony. There would be no redemption for little Leo. There would only be a reckoning. The first name on his ledger was about to be crossed off. The town of Redemption was aptly named for the sinners it attracted. It was a raw, chaotic hub of cattle drives and commerce, where a man's worth was measured by the weight of his purse and the speed of his gun. It was the perfect place for a man like little Leo to remake himself, and the perfect place for him to die. Jed rode in not as a storm of vengeance, but as a whisper of dust. He sold his horse, took a cheap room in a boarding house across the street from the opulent Grand Hotel, and he watched. For 3 days, he was a shadow. He saw Leo strut out of the hotel each afternoon, dressed in a garish silk vest and a new bowler hat, a gold-tipped cane in his hand. He watched him hold court in the saloon, buying rounds of drinks for anyone who would listen to his embellished tales. He followed him to the high-stakes poker game, observing from the shadows as Leo played with a reckless, nervous energy, his hands shaking as he raked in pots of gold. Jed learned his routine like a prayer. The saloon in the afternoon, the poker game at night, the brothel on the edge of town near midnight, and then the drunken, stumbling walk back to his suite at the Grand in the hours just before dawn. Leo had bought himself friends, finery, and women, but he hadn't bought peace of mind. He was a man constantly looking over his shoulder, a man terrified that the luck he'd stolen would finally run out. On the 4th night, Jed made his move. He slipped into the Grand Hotel through a service entrance, his worn boots making no sound on the plush carpets. He picked the lock on Leo's suite with a piece of wire, the skill as familiar to him as tying his boots. He entered the room and was met with the opulent mess of Leo's new life, half-empty bottles of champagne, discarded clothes, and a plate of half-eaten food. The air was stale with the smell of expensive cigars and cheap perfume. Jed didn't touch anything. He moved to the darkest corner of the room, melted into the shadows, and waited. Hours passed. The silence was broken only by the ticking of a grand clock in the hall and the distant, raucous sounds of the town dying down for the night. Finally, he heard it, the clumsy fumbling of a key at the door, followed by a muttered curse. The door swung open, and little Leo stumbled in, humming a tuneless, drunken song. He lit a lamp, the sudden glow illuminating his flushed, sweat-sheen face. He tossed his hat and cane onto a chair and turned to pour himself another drink. "You always were a sloppy drunk, Leo," Jed's voice rasped from the darkness. Leo froze, the decanter shaking in his hand. He turned slowly, his eyes wide with disbelief and pure, animal terror as they adjusted to the shadows and found the gaunt, bearded figure standing there. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "Jed," he whispered, his face draining of all color. "No, you're dead. We saw you. Silas shot you." "Silas missed," Jed said, taking a slow step forward into the lamplight. "He didn't finish the job. I'm here to fix that." Leo dropped the decanter, which shattered on the floor. He raised his hands, shaking his head frantically. "Jed, wait. It wasn't my idea, I swear. It was Silas. It was always Silas. He said your share was weakness. He made us do it. And you went along," Jed stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You took your 30 pieces of silver and you rode away." "I can give it back," Leo pleaded, his voice cracking. He scrambled towards a chest in the corner. "All of it. My share, your share, I'll give it to you. We can be brothers again." Jed just stared at him, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The man groveling before him was a pathetic creature, a sniveling coward. Any last, lingering ember of the brotherhood they once shared was extinguished in that moment. "I don't want the gold, Leo," Jed said coldly. "I want names. Places. Where are they?" Seeing a glimmer of hope, Leo began to talk, the words tumbling out of him in a desperate torrent. He told Jed everything. Dutch had taken his fortune north, to the Colorado mountains, buying a massive ranch to play cattle baron. Marco, ever the shadow, had slipped south, last heard of in a cutthroat border town near the Rio Grande. And Silas had gone west, toward California, talking about finding a flock of his own, a place to build his own kingdom. When Leo was finished, a pathetic, hopeful silence filled the room. He looked at Jed, his eyes begging. I told you everything. Are we good?" Jed raised his left-handed pistol, the movement smooth and practiced. Leo's eyes fixed on the gun, his face contorting in a mask of final, understanding horror. "Please, Jed. We was family," he shrieked. "We were," Jed said. Leo turned, a primal instinct to flee taking over. He scrambled for the door, his back to Jed. A single shot roared in the confines of the room. Leo collapsed, a hole drilled squarely between his shoulder blades. Jed walked over to the body, his face impassive. He reached into his own worn pocket, pulled out a single, gleaming gold eagle, and placed it on Leo's back, right beside the bullet hole. A payment. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door ajar. He wanted them to find the body. He wanted the story of the gold coin to be told. The legend had to begin. A man they shot in the back was back from the dead, and he was collecting debts. The air grew thin and crisp as Jed rode north into the Rocky Mountains. The oppressive heat of the Texas plains gave way to the cool, clean scent of pine and the formidable beauty of snow-capped peaks. It was a land of giants, a place of stunning vistas and deadly drops. This was the kingdom Dutch van der Linde had purchased with blood money. Leo's information was good. Jed found the ranch nestled in a wide, verdant valley, a fortress of new-cut timber and stone. Dutch had not retired quietly. He had established a barony, calling himself Mr. Vander, and ruled his domain with the same brutish force he had always employed. A dozen hard-faced men patrolled the property, their rifles a clear warning to trespassers. A direct assault would be suicide, and Jed was not a fool. He had learned from Silas that every man has a weakness. For Dutch, it was his pride and his explosive temper. Jed would not attack the ranch, he would attack the man. He made his camp in the high ridges overlooking the valley, becoming a predator on the mountain. For 2 weeks, he watched. He learned the patrol routes, the delivery times for supplies, the layout of the ranch house and barns. He saw Dutch, larger than life, bellowing orders at his men, his laughter a harsh, grating sound that echoed across the valley. He looked prosperous. He looked content. That would not stand. Jed's campaign was one of whispers and shadows. It began small. One night, he slipped down into the valley and cut a long section of fence on the far side of the property. By morning, 24 head of prime cattle had wandered off into the timber. Dutch flew into a rage, docking the pay of the men on watch and sending everyone out on a day-long roundup. A few nights later, a fire broke out in a remote storehouse filled with winter feed. Jed had set a slow-burning fuse and was miles away by the time the flames were spotted. The fire wasn't devastating, but it was another prick to Dutch's pride, another sign that he was not in control. His paranoia grew. He became more volatile, accusing his own men of incompetence and sabotage. The loyalty he had bought with gold began to fray under the pressure of his temper. Jed's final move was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He knew from their years together that Dutch's greatest source of pride was a monstrous, prize-winning bull he had purchased named Behemoth. It was the symbol of his power and prosperity. Jed rode to the nearest town, a place called Silver Creek, and spent a day in the saloon, playing the part of a down-on-his-luck ranch hand. He told a story to anyone who would listen, a carefully crafted lie about how he'd just come from a ranch back east where the owner had been swindled, sold a prize bull that was actually sterile, unable to breed. He described the bull in perfect detail, right down to the unique brand on its flanked brand of Behemoth. The rumor spread through town like a grass fire. Within 2 days, the story had made its way to Dutch's ranch. To have his virility, the very symbol of his empire, questioned publicly was an insult Dutch could not bear. His men told him to ignore it, that it was just saloon gossip. But his pride, raw and inflamed, would not let it go. Enraged and refusing to send a subordinate, Dutch saddled his own horse and rode out alone, thundering towards Silver Creek to find and crush the man who had dared to slander his name. Jed was waiting for him in a narrow, wooded pass miles from the ranch. It was a place of his choosing, where the towering pines cast long, dark shadows. When Dutch rode into the ambush, he didn't even see Jed until Jed stepped out from behind a tree, pistol in hand. "Hello, Dutch," Jed said, his voice calm. Dutch reined in his horse, his face a mask of shock, then fury. "You," he roared, his hand instinctively going for his gun. "Don't," Jed warned, his aim steady. "Get off the horse. This isn't about guns." For a moment, Dutch hesitated, but seeing the cold certainty in Jed's eyes, he slowly dismounted. He was a mountain of a man, his fists like slabs of granite. On his feet, on the ground, He felt he had the advantage. I should have put a bullet in your head myself, he spat. You should have, Jed agreed, and holstered his pistol. You were always better with your fists. That was all the invitation Dutch needed. He charged with a bellow of pure rage. The fight was not a duel, it was a collision. Dutch's power was immense, each blow capable of breaking bone. He drove Jed back, landing punishing body shots that stole Jed's breath. But Jed was no longer the man he had been. He was leaner, harder, and fueled by a purpose that pain could not extinguish. He took the punishment, weathering the storm, his mind cold and clear. He dodged and weaved, landing sharp, precise strikes to Dutch's face and ribs. It became a brutal, bloody war of attrition. They fought in the dirt and pine needles, their grunts and the sickening thud of their blows the only sounds in the quiet woods. Dutch, used to quick, overwhelming victories, began to tire. His rage made him sloppy. Jed, patient and enduring, waited for his opening. It came when Dutch threw a wild haymaker. Jed slipped under the blow and drove the hilt of his Bowie knife into Dutch's gut, then followed with a vicious elbow to his jaw that sent the big man stumbling backward. Gasping for air, bleeding from a dozen cuts, Dutch fell to one knee. He looked up at Jed, not with fear, but with a dawning, grudging respect. You came back from hell, he wheezed. I did, Jed said, his own chest heaving. And I'm holding the door open for you. Dutch tried to rise, to make one last charge, but his strength was gone. He slumped forward onto his hands and knees. Jed walked behind him. He did not use the knife. He drew his pistol, the one he had holstered. He pressed the cold muzzle against the back of Dutch's thick neck. This is for turning your back, Jed said. The shot was a flat, ugly sound in the pristine mountain air. The second name was crossed off the ledger. The trail to Marco led south, to the sun-scorched, chaotic border town of Tres Cruces. It was a place where the laws of the United States and Mexico met, mingled, and ultimately canceled each other out. It was a haven for smugglers, gunrunners, and wanted men, a city of shadows and secrets. It was the perfect environment for a man like Marco. Jed knew this would be different. Leo was a fool and Dutch was a brute. Marco was a predator. He was quiet, observant, and deadly. He would not be living a loud, ostentatious life. And he would be expecting Jed. The stories of the ghost who had killed Leo and Dutch, the tale of the gold coin and the bullet in the back, would have surely reached this far. This would not be an execution, it would be a hunt, and Jed was not the only hunter. He entered Tres Cruces and let the city swallow him. He sold his horse, took a room in a cheap cantina, and began to move through the city's underbelly. He became a ghost again, but a different kind. Here, he was not just watching, he was watching for the man who was watching him. Every alleyway could hold an ambush, every face in the crowd could be an informant. The tension was a constant, living thing. For a week, the city was a silent battlefield. Jed would feel a prickling on his neck, the sensation of being watched, and would turn to see nothing but a bustling marketplace. One evening, as he entered his room, he noticed a floorboard was slightly askew. A tripwire, meant to trigger a warning or a trap, had been set and then expertly disarmed. A message from Marco that he had been there. Another day, a knife thrown from a rooftop whistled past Jed's ear and embedded itself in a wooden post, quivering, a hand's breadth from his face. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, each man testing the other's defenses, circling, waiting for a mistake. Jed knew he couldn't win this game by waiting. He had to force Marco's hand. He had to draw the shadow into the light. The opportunity came with the announcement of the annual Dia de los Muertos Day of the Dead festival. The city would erupt in a riot of color, music, and masked crowds. In that chaos, a man could get close to anyone. It was the perfect stage for their final act. Jed learned that a powerful local crime boss, a man named Serrano, was holding a private party at his hacienda on the edge of town during the festival. Marco, Jed discovered through careful bribes and hushed conversations, was now working as Serrano's personal enforcer. He would be there, at his master's side. On the night of the festival, Jed donned a simple black coat and a calavera mask, a grinning skull that hid his face and made him one of the thousands of revelers in the street. He moved through the throng, the sound of trumpets and laughter filling the air. He slipped away from the main procession and made his way to Serrano's hacienda. Getting inside was a matter of patience and timing. He scaled the back wall, silent as a cat, and slipped into the courtyard, mingling with the masked guests. He saw him across the fountain-lit courtyard, Marco, and masked, standing near Serrano. He was dressed in fine Mexican clothes, but his posture was the same, alert, coiled, his hand never far from the knives hidden on his person. Jed couldn't make a move there. Instead, he created a diversion. He slipped a small pouch of black powder into a large, ornate brazier, with a lit cigarillo as a makeshift fuse. Then he moved to the far side of the courtyard and waited. The powder ignited with a loud fume, sending a shower of sparks and smoke into the air. The crowd panicked, screaming and scattering. In the confusion, Serrano's guards rushed him inside, but Marco's eyes of a hunter scanned the chaos, searching for the source. His gaze locked onto Jed's masked figure for a split second. It was all the recognition they needed. Marco gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and slipped away from the guards, melting into a dark, narrow alleyway that ran along the side of the hacienda. It was an invitation. Jed followed. The alley was dark, away from the festival lights, the music now a muted pulse. The air was cool and smelled of dust and bougainvillea. Marco was waiting for him at the far end, two long, gleaming knives in his hands. He hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. This was their language. Jed drew his own Bowie knife. The gun was useless here. This was a fight of speed and instinct. They circled each other, to ghosts in the gloom. Marco attacked first, a blindingly fast flurry of steel. Jed gave ground, parrying, his arm jarring with the force of the impacts. Marco was a master, his movements fluid and deadly. But Jed was not the same man Marco had known. He was a survivor, his movements economical and brutal, born of desperation and honed by a singular will. The fight was a silent, deadly dance. The scrape of steel on steel, the soft scuff of boots in the dirt. Jed took a cut on his arm, a fiery line of pain. He ignored it. He was looking for one opening, one mistake. It came when Marco, overconfident, attempted a spinning attack, a flashy move designed to disorient. For a fraction of a second, his body was open. Jed didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, not away, crashing into Marco's space. He drove his own knife up, under Marco's guard, burying it deep. Marco gasped, a sound of surprise. The knives fell from his hands. He looked down at the hilt protruding from his chest, then up at Jed. For the first time, an emotion flickered in his dark eyes, not hatred, but a kind of professional respect. "You got better," he whispered in Spanish, a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. "I had to," Jed replied. Marco slumped to the ground. 3 down. Only the preacher remained. The final trail led Jed west, through the high deserts and into the fertile lands near the California border. He was hunting not just a man, but an idea. Silas Kane had not simply hidden, he had ascended. He had taken his vast share of the gold and performed a dark miracle. He found a dying, God-forsaken town ravaged by drought and bandits, and he resurrected it. He brought water, law, and God. He built a new church, a new sheriff's office, and a new saloon, owning them all. He renamed the town Providence, and the desperate, grateful townsfolk called him Father Kane. He was their savior, their prophet, their king. And his kingdom was built on a foundation of betrayal and murder. When Jed rode into Providence, he knew he was walking into the belly of the beast. The town was clean, orderly, and unnervingly quiet. Men with rifles watched him from rooftops. Faces peered at him from behind curtains. This was not a town, it was a congregation, and Silas was its god. There was no element of surprise here. Silas was expecting him. Jed rode slowly down the wide main street, his gaunt frame and the grim set of his jaw a stark contrast to the town's placid facade. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't seek cover. He dismounted in the center of the town square, directly in front of the large, white-steepled church that stood as a monument to Silas's hypocrisy. He tied his horse to the hitching post and waited. Minutes later, the church doors opened. Silas Kane emerged, stepping out into the bright sunlight. He had not aged. He looked prosperous, dignified, dressed in the black coat of a preacher, a silver cross around his neck. He was flanked by 2 men wearing sheriff's stars, but he waved them back. This was between him and Jed. He walked calmly across the square, stopping 20 paces from Jed. His face was not one of fear, but of disappointment, like a father greeting a wayward son. "Jedediah," Silas said, his voice as smooth and commanding as ever. "I heard you had refused the peace of the grave. I confess, I am surprised. I always took you for a man who understood sacrifice." "I understand betrayal," Jed replied, his voice flat. "I understand a bullet in the back from a man who called me brother." A small, sad smile touched Silas's lips. "It was necessary. Look around you, Jedediah. From the sacrifice of one, I have created a paradise for hundreds. I have brought order from chaos, faith from despair. The gold you coveted for yourself, I have used to do the Lord's work." "The Lord's work," Jed let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You shot a man for gold, Silas. You can wrap it in scripture and build a church around it, but a sin is still a sin, and a snake is still a snake, no matter what garden it's hiding in. I offered you a martyr's death," Silas boomed, his voice rising into the familiar cadence of a sermon, playing to the unseen audience watching from the windows. "A clean end to a violent life. But you chose to crawl back, to bring your hate and your death into my sanctuary. You are the serpent here, Jedediah. A ghost of a past that has no place in this promised land." "Your promised land is built on my grave," Jed said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "I'm just here to foreclose on the property." He shifted his weight slightly, his left hand hovering near the butt of his pistol. Silas saw the movement. The mask of the preacher fell away, revealing the cold-blooded killer beneath. "It is a pity," he said, his voice losing its warmth. "I truly was fond of you, my son." "And Judas loved Jesus," Jed retorted. There were no more words. The world seemed to slow down. The dust motes dancing in the sunlight, the face of a child peering from a window, the glint of sun on the silver cross around Silas's neck. Silas's hand was a blur, his draw perfected by years of practice and self-assurance. He was fast. But Jed was not just fast. He was purpose. He was the culmination of months of pain, rage, and single-minded obsession. His left hand moved with an unnatural fluidity, an extension of his will. His gun was out, barking once, a single, definitive sound that echoed off the false fronts of the town Silas had built. A red flower bloomed on the chest of Silas's black coat. A look of profound, almost academic, surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the wound, then back up at Jed. His gun, which had just cleared its holster, fell from his grasp. He staggered backward, clutching his chest, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Jed walked forward, stopping before his former leader. He did not raise his gun to fire again. He just watched, his face a cold, empty slate. He watched the light of false righteousness fade from Silas Kane's eyes, replaced by the simple, animal fear of death. "Ashes to ashes," Jed whispered, the words tasting like rust. Silas collapsed into the dust of the town square he had created, and lay still. The debt was paid in full. Jedediah Stone stood in the silence. The shot still echoed in his ears, a final, deafening punctuation mark at the end of a long and bloody sentence. Silas's hired guns, seeing their Messiah fall, simply lowered their rifles and faded back into the alleyways. Their loyalty had been to the gold, not the man. The townspeople of Providence watched from their windows, their faces a mixture of terror and a strange, dawning relief. Their savior was dead, but so was their tyrant. The fire that had forged Jed in the desert, that had driven him across hundreds of miles, that had been his only reason to draw breath each morning, was now gone. It had been extinguished with Silas's last heartbeat. In its place, there was not peace, not satisfaction, but a vast, hollow emptiness. He had avenged his own murder, but the man he had been was still dead. This vengeful ghost was all that was left. He stood in the town square, a man out of time, his purpose fulfilled, with nowhere left to go. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in the same shades of blood and fire as it had on the day of his betrayal. He had reached the end of his trail, and now faced a final, unseen crossroads. As the adrenaline of the final confrontation faded, sharp, searing pain bloomed in Jed's side. He looked down, his hand coming away wet and sticky with his own blood. In the lightning-fast exchange, Silas's bullet, fired a fraction of a second after his own, had found its mark. He had been so consumed by his purpose, he hadn't even felt the mortal wound. A grim, ironic smile touched his lips. He had climbed the mountain of his revenge only to find his own grave waiting at the summit. He pressed a hand to the wound, turned his back on the silent town, and walked stiffly to his horse. He pulled himself into the saddle, a wave of dizziness washing over him. He rode out of Providence, not looking back. He didn't get far. A few miles into the desert, as the last sliver of sun vanished, his remaining strength gave out. He slid from the saddle and collapsed onto the cooling sand, the same unforgiving earth that had once refused to take him. This time, there was no will to fight it. His purpose was complete. There was nothing left to anchor him to the world of the living. Jedediah Stone closed his eyes as the stars began to appear, a ghost finally, and peacefully, returning to the dust.